Greetings, friends. My name is Alicia McBride, and I am the Director of Quaker Leadership at FCNL. Welcome to all of you who are sharing in the chat where you're joining from. Welcome to everyone. To our May Quaker Changemaker event, Seeking Truth, Healing, and Right Relationship, Quakers and the Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools. And as we begin, I'll ask my colleague, Emma Holbert, to share a little bit of the technical side of how we'll gather this evening.
Hello, everyone. Great to see you all. My name is Emma Holbert, and I'm the Program Assistant for Quaker Outreach at FCNL, and I'll be running technology for this event this evening. So I have a few tech considerations for you all before we begin. The first, which many of you are already doing, and that's fantastic, is just to share your name, location, and meeting or church if you have one in the chat. This is just a great way to build community virtually, and it's really fun to see who is here in the chat. So we're really glad that you all could be here with us. And as you can see, we are recording this event, but the audience will not be included in the recording for privacy reasons. Just the speakers will be in that video. That being said, feel free to turn off your video if you're uncomfortable keeping it on. We entirely understand. Again, captioning is available automatically, so that's my words popping up at the bottom of your screen. If you don't want to see those captions, you can click on the live transcript option on your Zoom toolbar, click hide subtitles, and that'll hide those on your own computer screen. We will have some time for you all to ask questions of our amazing panelists towards the end of the event. And we always do our best to address as many questions as we have time for, but just a warning that we likely won't get to all of them. So just a plea to send your questions in the chat as they come to you throughout the event, and then I will direct them to the panelists, which will be really great. For phone people, you can press *9 to raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask during the Q&A portion. We'll unmute you at that point and invite you to ask your question via the phone. But anyone that's on Zoom, we ask that you submit your questions via the chat. And finally, feel free to contact me if you're in need of any sort of Zoom tech support or support overall. You can either private chat me or email me at eholbert@fcnl.org, and I will put my email in the chat. Thanks so much, and back to you, Alicia.
Thank you, Emma. So I'm going to start by introducing our speakers, and then I'll invite us to settle into a period of worship to ground this conversation. First, Portia Skenandore-Wheelock manages FCNL's Native American Advocacy program. She is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and spent her formative years traveling between the Oneida Indian Reservation in Wisconsin and the Oneida homelands in upstate New York. Prior to joining FCNL, Portia was a law clerk for the Office of Tribal Justice at the U.S. Department of Justice, a liaison between a tribal agency and the Oneida Nation Family Court, and a director for a nonprofit organization serving tribal communities. We also have with us Paula Palmer, who is co-director of Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples, a program of Friends Peace Teams. Her ministry is under the Spiritual Care Boulder Friends meeting. In collaboration with Indigenous educators, Paula designs workshops to educate people about past and present injustices against Indigenous peoples and motivate them to take steps towards healing. Paula was the 2016 Pendle Hill Cadbury Scholar and researched and wrote about the role Quakers played in the forced assimilation of Native children by means of Indigenous boarding schools. Her collaboration with Indigenous peoples began during the 20 years she lived in Costa Rica. She is a recipient of the Elise Boulding Peacemaker of the Year Award, given by the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. And our third speaker is Jerilyn DeCoteau, a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. Along with Paula, she is co-director for Towards Right Relationship. She is also a retired lawyer who practiced Indian law and currently serves as Chief Justice for the Supreme Court of the Pueblo de San Ildefonso. Jerilyn is a founding member and past president of the Board of Directors of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. She was instrumental in establishing Indigenous Peoples Day in Boulder, Colorado, and is a co-founder of a local grassroots group, Right Relationship Boulder, which has several projects designed to build relationships with Indigenous people and tribes. So I want to thank all three of you for being here and for being part of this conversation. I know this is a personal issue and an important issue to each of you, And it is really an honor to be with you facilitating this gathering and to be with this amazing audience to have this conversation. As we begin, I want to invite everyone into a period of worship, holding our panelists and each other in the light for this conversation, and considering how Quakers are called to be change makers and to contribute to healing. And also today, as with every day, considering all the ways that violence is present in our world and in ourselves. Thank you, friends. As Quakers, we have a lot of mythology around our relations with Native people in the United States. And today, many friends, including through FCNL, are advocating in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. But there's an important part of this history that we still need to reckon with, the fact that Quakers were among the groups running Indian boarding schools in the United States. As a country, there's some movement to start reckoning with this history. Earlier this month, the Interior Department released its first report on Indian boarding schools, investigating the loss of life, cultural genocide, and lasting consequences of these schools and their forced assimilation program. The House of Representatives recently held a hearing on the bipartisan Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies in the United States Act, which would expand this effort to acknowledge the legacy of Indian boarding schools. FCNL has been working to support both of these initiatives, and Emma will put in the chat and will also share in an email after the event some more information on those initiatives if you would like to find out more. Our conversation today will talk some about these national efforts, while also focusing in on the role of Quakers played in these atrocities and how Friends can approach coming into right relationship with Native peoples given our history. So I want to start with some context and make sure everyone has some sense of what we're talking about in the history. So I want to ask Paula to start and share a bit about what Indian boarding schools were, why they existed, and how Quakers were involved with them.
Thank you, Alicia. I will do my best to answer that huge question, but I'll have to speak in broad generalizations. So I'll ask you all to please be aware of that. And first, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Colorado, where I live in the homeland of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. So Christian churches, including Quakers, started operating schools for Indigenous children in the late 1700s. The earliest Quaker schools were in New York and Ohio, and they were established at the invitation of Indigenous leaders like the Seneca chief Corn Planter. The schools, however, increased the divisions within some of the tribes, and Corn Planter himself denounced them later on. The federal government started financing schools for Indigenous children in 1819 with passage of the Indian Civilization Fund Act. Congress appropriated $10,000 a year to pay churches to operate day schools and boarding schools on the Western reservations. This amount increased over time, and churches operated most of the schools until the federal government opened its first boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1879. In other words, churches operated almost all the Indigenous boarding schools for a period of 60 years. many of them with federal funding. The stated goal of these schools was to Christianize and civilize the Indians, in quotations. This was the language used by both the government and the churches. And Quakers played a leadership role in this collaboration between church and state. I've been able to identify about 30 Quaker Indigenous schools. Some were boarding schools and some were day schools. And it's hard to pin down a number because some of the schools changed locations or changed names or passed from one religious denomination to another. Some were in operation for only a year or two. The longest run was 86 years at New York's Tunasasa School. The height of Quaker involvement in the forced assimilation of Indigenous children was during the Grant presidency just after the Civil War, when Quakers were employed as managers of all the reservations in Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. I want to read the names of the tribes whose children were enrolled in Quaker schools during that 8-year period to give you a sense of the scope of Quaker involvement. So during the Grant administration from 1869 to 1877, Quakers operated schools for these tribes. In New York, Seneca. In Nebraska, Santee Sioux. Iowa, Sac and Fox. Omaha, Winnebago, Otoe, Missouri, and Pawnee. In Kansas, Kansa, Shawnee, Potawatomi, Quapaw, and Kickapoo. In Indian Territory, what became Oklahoma, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Caddo, Wichita, Seneca, Kickapoo, Absentee Shawnee, Potawatomi, Cherokee, Sac and Fox, Modoc, Quapaw, Ottawa, Miami, Peoria, Iowa. So why did Friends promote and help carry out the policy of forced assimilation of Native children? What did they hope to accomplish? My research found that most Friends and other white Christians in the 19th century considered the Indigenous nations to be essentially failed societies, destined to die out. Quakers were sympathetic to the suffering and injustices inflicted on Native people by the US government and by unscrupulous settlers, although they did not critique their own role as colonizers and occupiers of Indigenous lands. Quakers believed that Euro-American Christian civilization, in quotes, was superior to the Indigenous ways of life. They wanted to offer what they considered the many blessings of this civilization to Native children, to, quote, rescue them and offer them what they considered to be a better life before it was too late. They thought assimilation was in the best interests of the children. They also hoped it would help bring an end to the ongoing wars between Indigenous nations and the US cavalry and the loss of life on both sides. The Quaker Indigenous schools were English immersion schools. Quaker teachers gave Indigenous children English names, cut their hair, and took away their clothes and replaced them with clothes provided by Quaker meetings. They put the boys to work on the school farms to produce food for the teachers and students, and they put the girls to work in the kitchens and sewing rooms, serving essentially as maids. They acknowledged that their aim was to change everything about Native societies by indoctrinating the children and changing their names, their language, their hair, their clothing, their gender roles, their economy, their dwellings, their family relationships, and their religion. Joseph Webster, the Quaker agent among the Santee Sioux, stated his intentions succinctly. He wrote, quote, "The whole character of the Indian must be changed," unquote. Many Indigenous parents resisted, even under threat of forfeiting their annuity payments if their children weren't enrolled in school. Other parents complied, hoping their children would be able to bridge the two worlds that they would have to live in. By the 1880s, many of the Quaker teachers felt they had failed in their assimilationist task. They gradually turned their schools over to the federal government or to other denominations. Some Quaker teachers began teaching at Carlisle and other government off-reservation schools. Many Quaker families in Pennsylvania housed Carlisle students during the summer months, putting them to work on their farms and in their households. Although these summer programs were represented as practical education, in fact, they prevented Native students from returning to their home communities in the summer and reestablishing family ties. They were a key part of the assimilationist agenda. During the 20th century, some important reforms were instituted in the federal boarding schools, but the policy was not entirely set aside until passage of the Indian Education Act in 1972 and the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act in 1975. The Bureau of Indian Education still operates 4 boarding schools for Indigenous children today, but these schools are entirely operated by Native staff, and they support Indigenous identities and cultures. So that's an extremely brief overview, but I hope it's a little bit helpful.
Yes, thank you, Paula. And I know you had mentioned when we were talking earlier, yes, this video that Emma's sharing in the chat, which I think is about an hour long, that goes into much more depth on this history for those who would like to dig in more. You know, I know for some of you on this call tonight, you may be familiar with some pieces or with all of this story. For some of you, you're hearing it for the first time, or it may be newer. But I know, Portia, I've heard you talk about how for Native people, this is not news. This is part of your history. Can you say a little bit more about your perspective?
Yeah, for the tribal perspective on this, you know, everyone's been anxiously awaiting Interior's report, not to discover anything new necessarily, but just to get confirmation of what we've always known. And what we've known has come from survivors and the stories passed down in our families. You know, this policy really impacted every single aspect of tribal life and tribal society. And quite frankly, if you look at, you know, reservations today and even the status of a lot of urban Indian communities, we're not better off than the societies we had, you know, before settlers came here. And I just want to mention too, because the numbers, when you're looking back at a specific era, might seem small in comparison today, but every Native person alive today has a connection to these schools and have been impacted by these schools.
Thank you. I know we're talking about a lot of history and things that have happened in the past and the impact that they have going forward and the ongoing harm and trauma that people continue to live with. And it makes me think of something that Paula wrote in a Friends Journal article a few years ago, saying that Native organizations are not asking us to judge our Quaker ancestors. They are asking who are friends today. So Portia, I was wondering if you could sort of respond to that idea, sort of what we can do going forward.
Yeah, I really like what Paula had said about that, because we can't change the past, and you know, it's not about shaming anyone for that past, but you know, how do we move forward, and how do we move forward together? And acknowledgement and taking responsibility, you know, is a part of making amends, especially since what came out of these schools isn't in the past. It's still very much alive today in tribal communities. I'm sure everyone's heard of all the statistics, you know, high rates of alcohol and drug abuse, poverty, suicide among youth, violence. All of these things might be statistics on paper to a lot of people, but those are real lives. Those are real people. You know, that's very much our daily life in many respects. So I think, you know, for Indigenous communities and tribal nations, we've been doing a lot of this work ever since these policies were put in place to heal ourselves, to carry on, to push forward. And I think it's time for, you know, the denominations of the faith community to take a look inward and reflect on the harm that was caused. As much as tribal people have been doing their own healing, I think some healing is needed for the faith community. You know, a lot of the crimes and human rights violations that were committed at these institutions, I'm assuming those do not fall in line with the moral teachings of various denominations. So I think people of those faiths need to look at that and kind of reflect and try to reconcile those things. And then at some point, I feel like both that faith, Christian faith sphere and the tribal sphere need to come together at some point to do some healing. But I do think at first we kind of need to do that on our own to some extent. I do want to talk about kind of the goals of the policy a bit, because as I was looking at the report, again, it confirmed what I'd already known, but just to see in writing a lot of the firsthand accounts and documents, the policy was so deliberate in its architecture, right? And it was intended to be so destructive. And a big part of that was cultural assimilation. But underneath that was this overall goal of land dispossession. And when people always ask, you know, what can they do? There's a number of things to do. And you may see articles pop up all the time about land back, efforts to give land back. Non-Native people are doing that all the time. Tribal nations have been buying their own land back for many, many years now. And reading about that policy of trying to make us Western farming practices, trying to adopt those, it really just goes to show how even planting our traditional foods and our traditional seeds, that is such a strong act of sovereignty, of resistance to these policies. You know, really everything we do to revitalize our language and culture, you know, that's a part of our healing, to heal from these traumas that are still very prevalent. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. Jerilyn or Paula, do you want to add anything to what Portia shared? All right, we can move on. Just want to give you the opening if you want. You know, in what you were sharing, Portia, I was hearing a lot about the need for rebuilding trust. And, you know, in addition to the work that faith communities and tribes are doing themselves, there's this critical part of the work that needs to be done together. And it's hard to do that when we don't, when the trust has been so broken by the past and the history. And that seems to connect to this idea of right relationship, which is a phrase we've been using in this event. And I know it's part of the name of the organization that Paula and Jerilyn lead. Jerilyn, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what does moving towards right relationship mean? What does it look like? You'll need to unmute yourself to speak.
Yeah, what a great idea. Thank you so much, Lisa. Yeah, I guess I have the easy task of talking about what right relationship means. Of course, we want to move beyond the dysfunction and the unequal relationship that was created through US policies, especially the deeply impactful and hurtful boarding school policy, to consider what right relationship would look like and how we can get there. So I just want to offer a few things that are really necessary to be able to work on right relationship and can be the first basic steps. So first of all, learning history, learning your own personal history and the history of this country. And of course, in learning the history of country, you'll learn the history of the Indigenous people too. So your history, I just want to say about that, learn your own history, your family's history. This is a foundational piece. Become grounded in who you are and learn your own connection to land. How did you and your family come to be where you live? And how did your family and your predecessors acquire the land you live on? Who was there before? Who were the people there before? And where are those people now? So that's just really kind of knowing your own story. And I think in the United States of America, a lot of people have never looked back at their own story to have a complete understanding. So I think this is important, to know who you are and where you came from. And then learn the history of this country. Learn about the doctrine of discovery, which provided legal justification for taking land and resources from non-Christian peoples and killing and enslaving them. The doctrine of discovery has become part of United States law from the earliest Supreme Court decisions, and it is the basis for all land title in the United States of America. The doctrine of discovery is embedded in our laws and society in the ways that we think and relate. Laws are, after all, a categorization of societal values and behavior. That's what they are. And we're required to act according to them. So understanding this, how it happened and how it continues to impact us is critical to being able to move forward toward right relations. We will have to undo systems that keep us, indeed require us to maintain the kind of relationship we have today. Because of the doctrine of discovery, because it is in our country's DNA, this isn't something that we can fix individually. We have to do it together as a society. So another important thing is to understand that Native people are part of sovereign nations called tribes in the United States. And tribes have all the rights of self-governance, including authority over their society, their resources, their culture, including language and the education of their children. There are 574 federally recognized tribes today, and everyone was deeply impacted by their children's boarding school experiences, which Portia so clearly pointed out when she was talking. So find out what tribes are doing to heal from the effects of colonization. It's actually pretty easy to research on the internet these days. Each tribe has a website and colleges. There are 37 tribal colleges. And each of them has a website and are usually addressing things like language and culture. So how do we work toward justice and truth? Right relationships can only be built on a foundation of trust and justice, which has been mentioned already, but building that trust takes time, and justice will require changing institutions and the policies that created them. Right relationship for us as individuals, I think, means listening more than we talk. We natives know a lot more about white people than you all know about us. But everyone has a story. Our stories have been largely left untold and hidden purposefully. So engage by listening. I just want to leave you with a story that was in the Denver Post today that Paula actually sent, and we've sent out to dozens of people since. It was following the release of Secretary Deb Haaland's report on boarding schools. And the article talked about how Hitler used the United States treatment of Native Americans as inspiration and a model for planning genocide and eradication of non-Aryan people in Germany. So in a 1928 speech, Hitler said that America, quote, gunned down millions of Redskins to a few 100,000 and now keep the modest remnant under observation in a cage, end quote. And he directed Nazi Germany to pursue analogous policies toward the Jews. The US stands as a role model to the world. We are all role models. What do we want others to learn from our behavior and our policies toward those we think of as other? And why do we even think of people as other? I just want to leave you with that kind of soul shaking part of that story. It just underscores how important this work is and how important what you all are doing today is. And thank you for letting me be part of this and be part of this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerilyn, for sharing that. Portia or Paula, do you want to add anything else about Portia, go ahead.
So that phrase, toward right relationship, I really like that because it's not talking about righting wrongs, right? Which in so many cases with Indigenous people, you can never correct those wrongs, right? They're true genocide and assimilation. You can't ever make that right. But I often think about what if these policies of genocide and land theft and cultural assimilation, what if that wasn't the route the government took and the settlers took. You know, what if we were seen as neighbors and allies, and what would society look like today? For one, there'd be a lot more Native people. But when I envision that, that kind of alternative history, right? That's what I'm thinking of toward right relationship, is that's what we could still be. You know, if we build connection, if we develop allyship, and those relationships have been building for a long time. You know, we have lived in friendship at different points in time. So I just want to encourage folks to do that. All of the things we've talked about, learning your history, engaging with Indigenous people, but also being respectful of that space. You have to remember that this might be something you're curious about or interested in, but for us, it's very real. You know, what happened in those schools is very real. We've all had relatives that have been so impacted by that. You know, that's real life for us. So engage and build connection and build relationship, but always reciprocate, right? Don't just take. So much has already been taken from us and from our communities. Make sure you're giving things back as well. And I just hope that that vision I have of that future can be a reality someday.
Thank you. Yeah, something that I think in the work that I do with Quakers, that my team at FCNL has thought a lot about, is this idea that relationship has to come first before action. You can't just jump to asking people for things before you build that relationship with them. And I also, you know, I think that's part of what the groundwork we're laying with this conversation. And I know that there will be people, many people are wondering what are the things, you know, as they're building this knowledge, as they're building relationships and sharing stories, what are the things that they can do? And I know that FCNL works on this from a legislative angle, you know, working on this Truth and Healing Commission legislation and in lots of other ways in solidarity with Native organizations, you know, at the sort of structural change level. And then there are lots of other pieces of this work. So I want to open it up to all of you to think about or to share some of the concrete actions that people could consider, or what have you seen Quakers or others doing that move in this direction? Paula, why don't you go ahead and start?
Okay. Yeah, well, one of the things that FCNL has taken the lead on is supporting the legislation that is before Congress now, that would establish the Truth and Healing Commission. So all of us in our, as individuals and as monthly and yearly meetings, my monthly meeting, Boulder monthly meeting, and the Intermountain yearly meeting have both approved minutes that are asking all of us within Intermountain yearly meeting to ask our senators and congressional representatives to sign on as co-sponsors of the bill, and of course to support it. So that's something that every single one of us can do, and that FCNL makes easy for us to do. One of the things that the Quaker schools definitely did was to try to eliminate Native languages by subjecting the children to English immersion education. And so I think it's, I think an appropriate sort of direct form of reparations is to support Indigenous language and cultural revitalization programs that are being brought about by tribes themselves, by tribal governments, but also by other nonprofit Indigenous organizations. In your community or around your community, you surely can find Native language and cultural revitalization programs that you could support. And I think that's just a very direct way to acknowledge the harm that was done when Quakers were operating Indigenous boarding schools. And one thing that I have been asking the yearly meetings to consider. And I think our yearly meetings are going to be having their annual sessions and their business meetings soon. So this is a timely request. The yearly meetings that supported the boarding schools, that financed the Quaker boarding schools, they need to look in their records and learn how much money they invested in the Quaker boarding schools. And not only money, but also material, tons and tons and tons of farm equipment and clothing and cloth and kitchen equipment, everything that was needed in the Quaker boarding schools, tons of that was sent by the Eastern and Midwestern yearly meetings to support the Quaker boarding schools. And I really think it's the obligation of the yearly meetings to do their own research on how it was that they supported these schools, and then ask themselves how they can convert that into today's dollars and invest at least that amount of money into Indigenous language and cultural revitalization programs that are run by Native people themselves, or respond in other ways, the kinds of things that Portia was talking about earlier and that Jerilyn was talking about earlier, many different ways that correspond in some sense to what was taken from Indigenous communities. So that's one thing that I hope Friends, as we go into our annual sessions, will be thinking about and proposing to our yearly meetings.
Thanks, and I see people sharing things in the chat, other suggestions. Please continue to share, and I wanted to just mention on John Meyer's point that yes, you don't have to wait until you have relationships to take meaningful action. Just that is part of the mix that's involved here. Jerilyn or Portia, do you want to add to what's been said?
I just want to say I really appreciate the comment that we don't have to wait for a relationship. Just want to maybe clarify a little bit about what relationship means. I don't think it means friendship. I don't think it necessarily means that you have to be friends with Native people. I think that building relationship can lead to friendship when you have the understanding and the trust, for sure. But if we all wait for friendships to happen, we might never get to the overall goal of building that trust and relationship with the larger idea. You know, one of the things I wanted to say at the beginning of my talk, which didn't quite seem applicable, but right relationship really applies to everything, animate and inanimate. And the sooner that we realize that we are interdependent in a symbiotic relationship with not just other people, but with everything in existence, you know, the healthier we'll be and better, more capable of building right relationships. So I think that word relationship doesn't necessarily mean on an intimate level. Thank you.
Yes, and I'll just add, you know, I've met many Quakers over the years, and the things I've seen different Quaker communities do, you know, a part of it has been becoming allies, and not just on tribal issues, but issues we all have in common, like environmental issues. So Jerilyn's speaking to that as well, right? Right relationship with land. And a number of Quakers, you know, joined Haudenosaunee people in an environmental campaign to stop hydrofracking in New York State. And it was successful. So there are a number of ways to right relationship. Land back is another effort. I've seen Quakers return land to Indigenous peoples. I've been on the receiving end of a very powerful land back effort. And so those are big things, right? There's also smaller things. And, you know, I'll mention the legislative piece quickly. So you can always reach out to your members of Congress. They love to hear from you more than they love to hear from lobbyists. But what we really need are more minutes and statements of support from, you know, more Quaker meetings and other denominations as well. they need to know that you all are supportive of this work and what the commission will accomplish, not only in looking, backward to the policies and the human rights violations of this era, but also looking at today and the consequences, and then looking forward to what sort of federal policies can start to correct some of the problems and harms that it's caused. And a big part of that that's been said is language revitalization. I would also encourage people to take Paula and Jerilyn's workshop. I just took it over the weekend, and I think it's a really good starting place to learn and to grow from. And supporting this legislation is so important to me. There's a sense of urgency. One, there are still survivors that are alive, and we need to hear their stories. And two, our languages are still very much dying. And a lot of our fluent speakers, they're elders now, and we need to do everything we can to not only protect them, but to learn from them and preserve their knowledge. So yeah, there's a number of things to do, and I think reflect on it, and whatever you feel called to do, that you've been given a long list of things, start with at least one of those things, right? Whatever you feel most called to do.
Thank you. Well, we've covered quite a lot of ground. Yes, thank you, Paula, for sharing the workshop link in the chat. We've covered quite a lot of ground in this conversation, and I'm sure that there are questions and things that people would really like to dig deeper into. So we have about maybe 10 minutes or so to address some audience questions. I know that some have already come in. I guess maybe keeping with the language theme, a question from Jonathan Betzal is whether learning Indigenous languages is a means of relationship building. And he says that that's been something that he's found inspiring. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to the idea of other non-Indigenous people learning native languages.
So I'll just share a story. I had a friend, I'm blanking on what tribe he's from, but he was telling me how his tribe had lost all their songs. And some anthropologists from the 1930s or 40, many years ago had come to his community, written things down, recorded things. And it was incredibly difficult and humiliating to have to ask for those records in order to have access to their own songs again. And I just share that because it's such a complicated thing, right? To have to ask non-natives for help for these things that were ours and that define us. There's a little bit of shame to that. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with learning other languages. It's great if we could all be able to communicate and learn and preserve those things. But just keep that in mind in conversations with Native people, that a lot of us do not know our own languages. A lot of folks are not fluent, and a lot of people are very much in the beginning stages. So that could be a painful experience to interact around that. But I think it's great to do your best to learn as much as you can and support revitalization efforts as much as you can.
Thanks, Portia. Let me see, a question from Deanna. Thinking about tribes that are not federally recognized, and she gives an example. Are there particular considerations in addition to what we've already talked about to support them?
I can take that one as well. So the irony of federal recognition is Congress has created a five-point test to prove whether you're a tribe or not. Language is one prong of that test. So again, it goes back to these core fundamental things to prove you are a distinct people. After they had a policy trying to erode all those clear distinctions of being a distinct people. So it's kind of unfair, right? It's counterintuitive, but that's the criteria to be federally recognized. And one of the ways we do get tribes that reach out occasionally for that support. One of the ways you can support tribes that are searching for that recognition, they need local support, you know, on the local level and then on the state level. That really helps them get immediate access to things. And then applying for federal recognition is incredibly complicated and complex. But there are tribal organizations that can help with that, like the Native American Rights Fund and different folks that know a lot more about how to go about doing that.
Great. I'll try to get a question that Paula and Jerilyn can jump in. Maybe Katie had a question about particularly thinking about impactful ways that young friends can help. I know they may not have as many resources to give. Would either of you have suggestions on young friends?
Yes. One of the things that young people can do is to get to know the Indigenous organizations in your community. Show up for Indigenous sponsored events. You know, there are powwows all around the country. And it's a pretty wonderful way to support Indigenous organizations and to learn about Indigenous people from Indigenous people, and to express appreciation. I remember at a talk that I gave at Palo Alto meeting a few years ago, they were mulling over things that they could do. And one person said, well, I've been going to the powwow at Stanford, but you know, I've never volunteered. I could volunteer. I could set up tables. I could set up chairs. I could offer manual labor. So, you know, consider those kinds of ways that you can be supportive of the Indigenous people in your community.
I might have something to add to this part of the discussion. Part of the problem of relationship is that we're not taught anything about Native people and their experiences, and we're not taught the boarding school experience. And every state has a different way of managing public education. And I know in Colorado, there's no overall policy about what must be taught. It's up to each individual school district. And then it's really up to individual teachers. So this article I referred to earlier from the Denver Post talked about that. And it says there's something like 10 schools that teach Indigenous history in Colorado out of, I don't know how many, you know, how hundreds there are. But it's really important to address that issue in the education of our children and what we're learning in school and in teacher preparation. Again, these are systemic things. These are things that require more than individual action, but it starts with one person. And I know there are a couple of teachers in the Boulder Valley School District that have just done a stellar job of teaching about Indian boarding schools and Indian history and the doctrine of discovery. And the kids are teaching their parents and they're teaching other teachers. You know, it's just the most inspirational. There was staff from the Museum of Boulder at one of the recent things that the kids did after learning. They did a timeline that looked at all the tribes in Colorado, and it started with the doctrine of discovery. So kids can do so much to carry these ideas, to start talking about them when they're young and little. But our school systems are failing so terribly, and there are some states that are doing a better job. But if you have any ability to have input in any way on teaching of this material, you should say so. You know.
One other thing occurs to me for young people is if you are in a high school that either has an offensive mascot, or if there are other schools in your county or your state that have offensive mascots, still start a movement among high school students to stop that. This is something that has to happen. In Colorado, we just had the school that is the closest, the high school that is the closest to the site of the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado is the Lamar High School, and their mascot was the Savages, if you can imagine this. And they just last week finally agreed to change that, that mascot name. But it took years of campaigning, and young people in this state were among the most effective people who bore witness to the damage that is done by offensive mascots. So I would love to see high school students organizing those kinds of campaigns.
Lots of good suggestions, and I see a lot more coming through in the chat. I will just say, I know that when my kids were in early elementary school, that the PTA brought in as a program some representatives of the tribes from the area to talk to the kids about their experience. And you know, so I think that's not so much a young person thing, but if for people who have kids in school, like thinking about how to add some of that to people's education, even if it's not part of the classroom. I guess I want to see if we can do one last question, and then we'll start closing. There was a question about the relocation policy that the government used to break apart tribes by promising employment in faraway places and encouraging people to leave their areas. I don't know if they mentioned AFSC helping to found an intertribal friendship house in Oakland to address some of the issues with that. I don't know if any of you can speak to that.
Well, I don't know what the specific question would be, but my family certainly experienced relocation, both my parents and me. My parents were relocated out to the West Coast. So we spent a number of years in Seattle when I was a child and in that area. And when I graduated from our reservation high school, later we did move back to the reservation. A lot of people do find their way back. The goal is to not have you come back. So when I was in high school, well, I got married shortly after high school. I was pregnant when I graduated. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs sent me and my husband to Salinas, California. And, you know, during that time, because we didn't have any money, but during that time, my father-in-law died and my mother was dying of cancer. And we were so far away from Turtle Mountain in North Dakota. So when we got done, we said, well, we'd like to go back to North Dakota and finish our college education. And the BIA said they would give us enough money to move to San Jose. And that was it. And from Salinas, which is not very far. And we didn't know what to do because we wanted so desperately to go home. And they ended up giving us a half a month's allowance, which was the whole month's allowance was $310. This was in 1968. So they gave us $175 and we took it and we went home to the res. And then we started school in the fall and, you know, went through college and grad school, and I went and ultimately through law school. But they really did work hard to make you not go back to the reservation. They don't want you back there. So they wanted to close when they started that relocation program, termination was the policy. And they were trying to dismantle reservations. They were liquidating all tribal resources and you know, giving them out as money. So you might get a wealthy tribe, for example, was the Klamath tribe. They liquidated all of their resources, and the tribal members got something in the neighborhood of, you know, $30,000 or $40,000. Lots of used car dealers made a lot of money. Clearly not much for a birthright, you know, and sale of your homeland, and really the dissolving of your reservation and your tribal status. I mean, people would go around saying, well, am I an Indian anymore? You know, who am I? What am I? So it was another forced assimilationist policy, and it was another stab at identity, at just destroying who Indian people were as a people. So it just, you know, it's just been relentless. And that policy ended, I think, sometime in the late 60s, not too long after I was relocated. And we finally did get to a better policy of self-determination when Richard Nixon was the president and the Indian Self-Determination Act was passed, and we've had a different course since then. But there's been so much damage. And there are renewed efforts. You know, it's always been about taking resources. It's always been about that, whether your resources were land or oil and gas or your children, you know, whatever your resources are, it's still about that. It's still about pipelines. It's still about land. It's still about identity. And we live in a really frightening time because I think we have a lot of people in Congress who don't believe, and maybe even in the Supreme Court, who don't believe in tribal sovereignty anymore. So it's very frightening. The Indian Child Welfare Act is coming up for argument in the Supreme Court. And the Indian Child Welfare Act rests on the fact of tribal sovereignty. That's why it exists. And if they say that the Indian Child Welfare Act is unconstitutional because it violates equal protection, that will be the first domino in all of the tribe's sovereign powers. They'll all fall because that's the legs that it stands on. If it doesn't have those legs, then nothing else has those legs either. It's very frightening. And I know you all, you know, you will probably be working on that issue in ways that you can, just like you've done with the missing and murdered Indigenous women, which I've had the pleasure of working with some of you on a testimony regarding that and all the other things. But it's very frightening what's happening in this country. The destructive policies aren't completely over, and they're likely to resurrect in one or another. Scary times.
Yes, definitely. Well, I know that we could keep talking on this for a long time and share a lot of good information. I did, as we want to close, I wanted to ask you maybe a more, I don't know, it feels like this whole conversation has been very personal, but like, you know, I think that something that can be really challenging working on these issues is how you keep yourself going. And so I don't know if either any of you would want to share a little bit about your own personal sort of how do you approach that question of keeping yourself going, Portia?
Yeah, it is a good question. And I was in a lot of pain when the Pope was talking about the boarding school issues. You know, it brought up a lot of emotions. But what makes me continue this work is feeling connected. I feel connected to my great grandmother who attended the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. She was the last fluent Oneida speaker in my matrilineal line. So I'm inspired by her. The struggles of my grandmother. I feel connected to all these women in my family, and my mother who attended the Flandreau Indian School in the Dakotas. And conversely, with the children I help raise, helping them navigate this complicated world while maintaining a strong connection to who they are and knowing or hoping that they won't ever have to endure the things that my grandmother did at Carlisle. And I also feel called to speak to all of you to share a different perspective about this, because although education was weaponized, very much weaponized during this era, education is power. And I hope we all have grown a little bit from this conversation and you all feel called to take action.
Well, I would just say that I'm grounded by my collaboration with Jerilyn and with all of the Indigenous people who work in the Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples program. I keep having opportunities to learn. Some of them are painful. Many of them are joyful. And so I am grateful every day for these opportunities that come to me through this work.
And I'll just say, you know, what keeps me going is really there's no choice. What's the other choice? And I'm just grateful that we have people like you all to listen and to carry the message forward. We didn't always have that. And I think our allies are growing in number and in skill and knowledge, so that they really do know how to do this work. And they're not just siphoning off information or not being reciprocal, as Portia was talking about earlier. So really, there's no choice. I have 8 grandchildren. 2 of them are great-grandchildren. They all live on the reservation. I love it that they live there, but I'm scared to hell that they're living there, because they live in a very tiny world. And I don't know what's going to happen to them. I try to bring them out as much as possible. But the reservations are very confined places. They really are those cages that Hitler talked about. And they're wonderful cages in some ways, because they're home and you feel connected to family and land, but they're also very confining. So we really do need your help, and we really do appreciate it. And that's what keeps me going. Thank you. And working with Paula certainly helped me too. It's put me in touch with all of you kinds of people for sure. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for being here. You know, we've talked about so many ways to be doing this work and learning and growing, and how Friends can use their knowledge and their resources to support this work. And I know many of you will be thinking about this as you go forward, and all of the suggestions people have shared. I did want to mention that these conversations that we do every month are sustaining for me, and in bringing these perspectives together, and in providing a platform to share, and connecting our history as Quakers to the present and the future. And if they're valuable to you, I hope you might consider also a gift to FCNL. Right now we have a matching opportunity so that your gift is doubled. So I'm sure that you could go to the FCNL website and learn about that. But with that one small thing, I want to turn it back to Emma, who will share a few more wrap up, next steps, and a little bit more about our next Changemaker event, which is really building on this idea of what we do with the history that we are learning about.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. So quickly before we conclude this event, I just want to share a few things with you all. The first is very simple. If you are at all inspired by tonight's discussion and want to take action, FCNL has an action alert, which is just a first step, but a great first step that you all can take. And then I just wanted to share that next month's Quaker Changemaker event really builds on some of what this conversation raised, looking at the topic of reparations for slavery from both a legislative and community action perspective. So Abby Rahman Davies, who's leading FCNL's work around HR 40, is going to be in conversation with Lucy Duncan of Green Street in Philadelphia. And through their reparations committee, Green Street is putting significant resources towards reparations for the Black community in their part of Philly. So this event will take place on June 22nd at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. And I will put that in the chat as well. And I finally just want to say, I know there was a lot of resources shared in the chat, and I personally sent lots of links in the chat, and I know it can be chaotic to try to sift back through to find them. Not to worry, I will include those in the follow-up email along with the recording of this event that you can share with anyone and everyone tomorrow. And with that, I just want to say thank you all so much for joining this Quaker Changemaker event. And a huge thank you to our amazing, incredible panelists, Portia, Paula, and Jerilyn, and thank you to Alicia for moderating this rich discussion. I hope everyone has a great night, and I hope to see you again next month.